everybody. Welcome here. Show 148 on Crypto Voices. Matthew Mežinskis, your host here from the Baltic States, joined here by my co-host Alec Harris from the eastern seaboard states of the U.S. and Halo Privacy. Alec, what's going on, man?
What's up? I love this new moniker there. This Matty Big Dog. Is that self-declared or like?
Nobody was going to see that on the recording. Now I have to not cut this. We'll see. But yeah, that's just, you can call me that. No problem.
Cool. Awesome.
And very happy to introduce now our special guest, Yaël Ossowski. He is a visiting fellow at the Bitcoin Policy Institute, deputy director for the Consumer Choice Center, and the co-host, I believe, of a fairly new Bitcoin podcast, Fix the Money, which I was happy to be on, in fact, this week. And I just figured, why don't we just turn the tables and bring you on ours, good sir. So, Yaël, thanks a lot for coming on and welcome.
Well, yes, Matt, thank you so much for having me here on the program. Good to talk to you. I've spoken to you on a couple of other occasions, and now I get to be on your stream and podcast. This is a lot of fun.
Yeah, I'm glad to have you do the vast majority of the talking now. What do you want to focus on to start? I mean, you want to go banking, as we talked about when I was on your show, or do you want to talk about some of the legislative changes that we've seen at a state level, which is pretty interesting in the United States for Bitcoin, or anything, piquing your interest on the podcast?
Well, yeah, it's gave me a lot of good areas to start with. I think looking at the legislative stuff in the U.S. is very interesting. And I think you guys would definitely agree, as holders of American Eagle passports, looking at what's happening in, the good states, red states at the moment, you have a lot of pressure on politicians to get in the know on various financial matters. So we're talking about the bank runs, we're talking about the banking crises, but at the same time, we're also talking about CBDCs. And there's been I think, a pretty fervent push, I'd argue, from many different groups, whether they be consumer groups, a lot of conservative groups, many who are Bitcoiners, those who are in the crypto world, to try to figure out how best to try to oppose central bank digital currencies. And there's been a lot of pressure on specifically governors in red states to do something about it. And we saw Kristi Noem, who is, as I am now a resident of South Dakota, a nomad resident. She is, very fiery on many different issues. Sort of your normal, typical social conservative. And she whipped out the branding iron to veto a bill that she claimed would have created a backdoor for CBDCs in South Dakota. So there's a lot of fervor around it.
You wrote a great article on this. We'll link to it in the show notes. You want to go through that a little bit?
Yeah, so this has to do with something called the Uniform Law Commission. Sounds terrible and nerdy and strange, and it is, but this is essentially a commission of private lawyers, of different experts from different fields. They get together and just create a model bill, or a set of model bills, that should be the same throughout the United States of America. So many people don't know this, but most of the laws in the U.S. are at the local level, usually at the state level. That's where you have most of your criminal law. It's where you have a lot of your commercial law. So they create this entire sort of model bill that different states can implement to ensure that there's some kind of uniformity, right? So you have a contract between a company in Texas and one in Delaware. You don't want to have, strangely, wildly different rules in either jurisdiction. So what they've done is they've created a kind of model bill that can be implemented. And there's a part of it called Article 12, which deals with digital assets. And in short, this is a very good bill. It protects Bitcoin. It protects self-custody. It protects the ability for you to use Bitcoin or any other cryptocurrencies in commercial contracts. And the way that it is written in, they don't use the term Bitcoin and everything else. They use the term controllable electronic records. So a lot of it is about how you have ownership of that particular asset. And unfortunately, what happened is you had a lot of misinterpretation by social media influencers and people online that this created some backdoor for a CBDC. That got up to the governor. She immediately vetoed it. At the same time, Ron DeSantis sniffed this out, and he's sort of on the presidential tour right now, and he created his own little press conference where he said, "Hey, no CBDCs here in Florida. Come for the sunshine, but no central bank digital currencies." So it kind of created this firestorm. And what I did is I called up the guys who actually wrote this thing, as journalists do. and I asked them, and all of them actually are Bitcoiners themselves. They all hate central bank digital currencies, and they just wanted to find the best way in commercial law in the United States to advocate for Bitcoin. And that's what they did, and that's why they wrote this bill. And unfortunately, now it's been maligned, and I understand exactly why no one would veto it. I understand why any Republican governor would oppose it in that current context and framing. But everybody's wrong, and the truth is kind of, left out to the wind.
Yeah, because the confusion there is that, they're not classifying Bitcoin as money. They're classifying it as something else. But in this circumstance, that's actually good.
Yeah, and that's the whole entire question is you have different crowds, amongst Bitcoiners, right? You have those who are big fans of U.S. legal tender will be Bitcoin. For them, that's very important. For there's an entirely different sort of cypherpunk angle where you don't want the government even involved in any way possible. And you surely don't want them having any kind of control or larger treasury because they could overtake all of us with, trillions of dollars. So I think that's where you have this, that's where it rubs up against one another. And unfortunately, we have great state-based policy on Bitcoin that could be implemented. And unfortunately, right now, it's going to be very difficult to do that without having to talk incessantly about CBDCs, even if the bill would have nothing to do with it, doesn't mention it. And realistically is very good for Bitcoin.
Yeah. I mean, I talked with Marty on TFDC a lot about this yesterday. I mean, it seems to me that, and Balaji as well, even though he's given some outrageous price predictions and he's not exactly describing FedNow correctly, it's definitely not a CBDC. But I certainly agree with the whole sentiment that he's trying to do here with this bit signal and his whole $1 million bet thing. One of the things I saw, which I think really rung home with me, especially living over here in Europe, is, it's not, we don't need to immediately assume that we're going to just fall into this sort of hellscape of the capital, Hunger Games style, is going to regulate everything as it goes with both CBDCs and with Bitcoin. And everybody else in the whole country is just going to be left out in the cold. As he said, and I think is certainly absolutely true, there are plenty of red states, Bitcoiners are for Democrats as well, but there are plenty of red states which seem to be wholeheartedly, also in the wake of everything that happened with COVID, just embracing more localized, pro-freedom type legislation. And he was saying in Texas, they're even going to put it on the docket this year to try to have it where Bitcoin, it's going to be full property. I don't know all these legislative layers, right? But it's going to be on the Texas legislative, up for a vote basically this year, that Bitcoin will be treated as property in Texas that would never be able to be seized. Basically, that's how he said it.
Currently in the law, Bitcoin is technically, per the IRS, considered property.
Right.
And I think a lot of people are that's what they were getting very upset about is, well, they're calling Bitcoin not money. That is our only goal. Therefore, we're mad at this. When you actually look at it and you get into legalistic interpretations and you're talking about, law, you're not talking about your own value prop or what you consider. It's just what does the law consider? And if the law considers that Bitcoin is money, that means it is subject to extra restrictions that you or I would not want. You would have much more financial surveillance of the entire Bitcoin protocol. You would have actual, chain analysis groups would essentially be deputized by governments and would have their own departments because they would have to track all this stuff. You want to have, in the current legalistic framing that exists, you want to have Bitcoin as property. You want to have it in this kind of new category, ideally, that would be a non-controllable electronic record or a digital asset. We just don't have that in the law yet. And I think that's where there's a lot of confusion. People want to score points and likes and views. And I found... Basically, I've been advocating in policy, for about 10 years now, doing it more loudly with Bitcoin and generally the sort of crypto ecosystem probably the last 3 years. And I find that a lot of the influencer type stuff it's kind of dangerous because you can get a lot of misinformation out there. And this stuff is very problematic because it actually could impact laws that make it much harder to access those fiat on or off ramps, which, as we know right now, are currently being closed.
Can we pivot over to this, and forgive me if I pronounce it incorrectly, but the Catawba digital economic zone that you were writing about? This is kind of novel. And can you unpack it a little? Like, why is it a novelty? Does it matter? Can we leverage it?
The Catawba digital economic zone, it's a wonderful idea. So we have had economic zones in various jurisdictions, many of them in Honduras, throughout Latin America. And this idea is you get a private charter from a government that basically says, hey, on this plot of land, your rules don't apply, our rules do. And there's all kind of different caveats, and they haven't worked well in Latin America because you tend not to have good rule of law. So this one is put together by a couple of folks out of the Carolinas, and it's with the Catawba Nation. So the U.S. Constitution and many different rules and laws in the states actually have huge advantages carved out for Native American tribes. And that's sort of the angle that this particular zone took. It's a DAO type thing, and I have to admit, I don't know much about DAOs. I am usually fairly skeptical of this stuff because they usually require their own token, and there's all kinds of strange governance stuff. But what they're aiming to do in their digital economic zone is not just allow people to register companies, but also to have the best model policies when it comes to digital assets. So that's why they signed up to have Article 12 of UCC as quickly as possible. And they're also working on other bills as well that would, protect some of these decentralized autonomous organizations, that would protect your property if that was Bitcoin or something else. So I think they're doing something very interesting. It's all technically in cyberspace, but using the sort of legal front, the legal protection of an Indian nation, U.S. federal law.
So, but can anyone in the U.S. sort of register there and leverage it, or do you have to be a resident? How does that work?
So you can anybody can use it. The only question is it going to be, validated for your purpose? Is it going to be used, can you use that going to the bank? That's a whole other question. And I think we've seen that with many other places. I mean, there are all kinds of these economic zones, or people come up with, these small countries, an example like Liberland, which exists between Serbia and Croatia, which is essentially a self-declared piece of land by a Czech politician. His name is Vít. Vít has, he went there a couple of years ago, planted the flag of Liberland, made it a libertarian nation. Upon my own visit there, I found that, the only thing you'll see there is handcuffs on your wrists by the Serbian authorities if you try to go. But people are trying to always build these kind of new nations. And, related to Balaji, his book is actually great. I don't know if you read it, The Network State. He talks a lot about this, that, if you want to really have the true economic freedom that everybody talks about, you need to be able to crowdsource. You need to be able to actually get together some kind of territory. People need to be doing this online. And eventually we'll get to a point where we'll have some kind of physical jurisdiction, physical property, where we can actually practice our economic freedom much freer than today.
As the sovereign individual predicted as well, like 20 years ago.
Indeed.
Oh, longer.
More.
Yeah, it was in the 90s.
90s, yeah. 90s, yeah.
You guys saw Do Kwon was arrested in Montenegro yesterday?
I didn't.
Yeah.
Man.
Oh, yeah, sure did.
So he was arrested at the airport with fake docs, but he's not on the run. Just, thinking of a guy looking for a better jurisdiction. Didn't quite find it. I don't know why he came, to that part of the world. I want to play devil's advocate a little on the CBDC front. The Chinese are well on their way, right? And they will use every bit of economic and otherwise influence to promulgate the use and force and mandate the use of their CBDC. So how do Western currencies maintain as an outpost, right? Not force this kind of like surveillance currency on people, but still remain competitive? What's the trajectory between a digital currency and non-digital currency?
Oh, that's a good one. Have you heard about fiduciary media? um, I think this is it's an interesting argument because Matt talked about this the other day on another podcast. But the idea that you have so much innovation in the banking and finance world in Europe as compared to the United States, that is in itself an issue and a problem, and slows things down. And those of us who hold a foot in both continents, makes it much more difficult to transfer money. So I do think there will have to be advantages, but that's on the private sector side. That's on the bank side. That's on the financial apps and inclusion side. It's not up to the government to make it so that people can spend the money as easily as possible. They're doing a very good job of that on their own. But when it comes to the sort of consumer application of money, you should have private innovators come up with all kinds of different things. We see right now, this is related to the Operation Choke Point 2.0, but Cash App and specifically Square and Block, they're sort of in the crosshairs for many different short sellers and, who knows, law enforcement, no idea. But there you have a good financial product that a lot of people can use. They're able to use Bitcoin natively and the US dollar natively. They're able to use the Lightning Network on there. And we just don't have that with so many other applications and apps. And the only problem will be, what are the on and off ramps? And that's where China just says, hey, we'll just control everything, right, from A to Z. But in the US, there's just all these different compliance things. It's very difficult to be able to actually send dollars if you don't have the correct permissions. So I agree there's got to be innovation. I just don't think it has to take place, out of the Federal Reserve building in Washington, D.C. It can happen amongst many different private entrepreneurs who already have solutions. And indeed, people are building on the Bitcoin protocol every day with all kinds of solutions that are awesome and great and cool. We just don't yet have a circular economy to where people are making Bitcoin and then able to spend it. Everybody has to convert. But once we kind of reach that pinnacle change, we wouldn't have to do that anymore. So it's kind of incumbent upon all of us, if we do believe in the tech as well, to continue with the circular economy, use it as much as you can. I definitely do that for my haircut, all my servers online. I try to pay with Bitcoin, payments between friends. I think that's the kind of stuff, smaller scale, but, it grows more and more. And, that can be in parallel to the USD system. It doesn't have to be on the totally opposite side.
Yeah, the hard thing is they're always going to claim and cry money laundering. Alec, I don't know if you're referring to that report, Yael. Alec sent me that report about Square Block.
The Hindenburg one.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're very effective at what they do, right? So Hindenburg research, right? They're short sellers. They set up their positions and then they do very in-depth and, at times laudable investigations into publicly traded companies. And they benefit from the negative media backlash once their report is released. But their argument is, well, the reports are accurate, right? So people need to know, and this is an actual function of short sellers, is to sort of self-regulate the market. And they went after that what turned out to be a total sham electric truck company. I'm blanking on the name. It was a couple of years ago. That was kind of their original, most famous one. And then the Adani Group was only a couple of months ago. Out of India, and now Block. And so the Block report is scathing, right? And I would, we can link to that in the show notes, but, everything from propping up fake numbers of daily active users, monthly active users. But the real thrust of it is in how easily Cash App is used for fraud, right? And the fraud department inside of Cash App does almost nothing to try to eliminate fraud. So much so that, for instance, if I'm a scammer and I have 100 fraud accounts and they identify one of them, all they do is shut down the one account that was identified and they let me run the other 99. And so it's used for money muling and fraud and payments for illicit products, right? And so the problem I see, right?
Well, that's the allegation, right?
Correct.
It's not like confirmed.
Yeah, but they cite. And you're right, it's an allegation, but they cite firsthand, insider documents on how that fraud department works. So, and whether it's all true or not, right? The issue is this will be painted as Bitcoin's fault, right? And nothing in that report has anything to do with Bitcoin, right? It's just pure, like you could do that kind of fraud on Venmo or PayPal. And so that's the downside, right? Is it'll just be fodder.
Yeah, that's true. I think the greatest retorts to the report that I saw is, well, if you just remove the word app and make it cash, that's actually a real danger of money laundering is USD cash.
Yeah, $100 bill.
Yeah, there's a lot of resources that were put into this, and you can definitely see there's a lot of, I saw a lot of inside information because they say firsthand, it can't just be like one person at Cash App or Block, whoever, who's releasing all this information. This is a pretty coordinated thing. And look, I don't follow many of these financial reports of short sellers and things like this. You guys probably have a better gauge on that than I do. It's just the most convenient of timing. And, it's just the restricting of the on and off ramps. I think Cash App as a customer product has been incredible. Not a lot of people know that outside of the US because it's only for Americans right now. But I mean, it's actually works way better than PayPal, works way better than many other apps. Again, I don't know the internal mechanics of it. And I'm sure every company makes mistakes. There are probably some things, but yeah, I don't know what to say about that. I wonder if there's going to be other analyses of the report because I'm not familiar enough with Hindenburg and kind of what they do. So you guys could probably tell me a lot about that.
Well, I'm sure there'll be.
But I agree, short sellers are important in a free market economy. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that too. And typically there's a response from the accused. Adani had a response that was almost as long as the original report. So. Yeah, I agree with you, Yael, on this. Like, I think Cash App is a great gateway drug. Like, if you're like, hey, if you don't really know where to start, you're non-technical, and you want to just download something and be able to quickly have a Bitcoin wallet, it works really well, and it's really clean. There's not a lot of noise in there. So I'd rather see it survive than go away.
Yeah, and unfortunately, it's not open source. It'd be great, you just fork it off, and then you have an entirely different governance system behind it. I think I've been getting way more into GitHub, I would say the last 6 months, just learning how different projects are, what you can do, things you can change. It's actually pretty incredible. There's a great new, and I'm not affiliated at all. There's a new iPhone app called Stack Wallet. And this one actually integrates BIP47 paynims, payment codes, which before is only Android people. And essentially, the payment code allows you to have this reusable code that just generates a new Bitcoin address each time. Now, this is available on iOS for the first time. And, in the US, iPhone is king. Outside the US, Android is king. But this is actually very good for private Bitcoin usage and adoption and everything else. And I'd love to see that evolving on GitHub. And now you can fork it, make it a Bitcoin-only app because they have other coins in there for right now. But that stuff is kind of great to see. That's why one thing that's just so great about the Bitcoin network protocol, people around it, is that there are people from all different types of expertises who work on this. If it was only the developers, the computer scientists, it would go in a particular direction. But you've also got the people who care about economics, the people who care about privacy, the people who care about the actual code, the people who care about, legalistic matters and getting the law right. It's kind of great to see that. And you really only have that with this decentralized protocol that is Bitcoin, where you don't have a board of directors or CEO or even a marketing department.
In the last maybe 1 or 2 days, even since we talked, I've been seeing much more about Operation Choke Point 2.0, presumably people sending screenshots of limitations of fiat, USD fiat in particular, to USD type registered Bitcoin exchanges to buy or sell Bitcoin. Do you have any thoughts on that? And have you seen or do you have any experience with that in your dealings in Europe?
Well, it's definitely happening. There's a lot. I think the biggest one was Kraken no longer accepting ACH deposits, which is huge. This is a big deal. And we've already saw with the collapse of a sort of Signature and Silvergate, you just don't have that many banks that are willing to hold the cash for different cryptocurrency companies and firms. I've already kind of seen it, and this is a very arcane small issue, but there's something called a money transmission license. So this is issued by a state to allow a company to transmit money between entities or people. And in the US, it depends on the state. Montana is kind of the gold standard because they don't have these rules. But essentially, any Bitcoin brokerage exchange, crypto exchange has to get one of these licenses. And what we started noticing is starting in South Dakota, ding, 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 and then also in Texas, is that the banking supervisors of those states started either not allowing the renewal of that money transmission license or all of a sudden requiring that they have much more liquid assets, requiring that they have many more forms, requiring that they have, more transparent board of directors, all this kind of stuff. And that meant that many of these different custodians who apply for these, an example is Prime Trust, they weren't allowed to serve clients anymore. Well, that meant that Swan Bitcoin and Strike, they couldn't serve any customers in South Dakota or Texas. So if you're trying to quote stack sats in these places, because of this arcane, and I would say kind of discriminatory change in policy, it locked people out of that system, at least for that app, right? So that is something that's happening just kind of like at the small granular level. And then you're seeing it a bit more in the UK, where in the UK, many banks are now explicitly saying you cannot wire to cryptocurrency exchanges. So they're setting up internal policies. Now, I think it's our goal should be to figure out what is at the source of that. Is it pure de-risk? Or is it some kind of government memo that went out, some kind of information, some kind of thing from, whether it be the police, whether it be from, regulatory agencies, that is happening. And that's why the Balaji bet is so interesting, because it's not just about, number go up. It's about what is going to happen in these preceding 3 months and what is happening. And I do think there's this clamp down on the fiat rails to the crypto world. I think that's very concerning. However, I remain hopeful because there are many different services and protocols and technologies that exist so you can continuously trade peer-to-peer. Non-KYC stats where you don't have to use, the official cryptocurrency exchanges. You can just exchange between people. I mean, I've been doing this since 2013, and I know many others have as well. A lot of people do that, on the African continent and Asia and in Latin America. People use things like Telegram, or they use different apps. So I think that is going to have to grow. But yeah, I think in the short term, it does mean that a lot of people are not going to be able to access that cryptocurrency that they're probably looking for.
Do you think there's a way to turn that tide, or is this, really the beginning of the, now they fight you phase, and everybody better buckle in?
Bro, it's pretty big. I don't know. It's like you're talking about geopolitical factors, huge things, a lot of licenses. It's very difficult. I mean, I think you should always, if you're interested in that, and you happen to, have sat stacking as one of your hobbies on your LinkedIn page, you should probably have a couple of different sources where you're able to do that, whether it be apps, whether it be exchanges, brokerages, people some kind of income stream that would be in Bitcoin or something else. I think everybody, it's incumbent upon you to figure out how that best works for you. And I think, yeah, look, you're going to have to use your jurisdictional arbitrage. There are some exchanges that you can use where, they don't necessarily ask where you live or where you are, or, you only have to upload a document. This is kind of what people are driven to do. I mean, I'm sure you guys remember the early days buying Bitcoin everywhere, all kinds of strange exchanges, Chinese exchanges, Indian exchanges. All you needed was an address, didn't need any ID. That was back in the day. And then it was all of the money laundering laws, everything KYC, that sort of started getting implemented really in the last 6 years or so. There are options out there. I just hope people find them. And a lot of the innovators and entrepreneurs who are dedicated to this stuff, they're using all these various technologies like Peach Bitcoin, HODL HODL, all the rest. I mean, there's all these different techs that people can use. Not everybody can do it. Not everybody is technologically proficient, but I think the apps are only getting better.
Yeah. Did you guys see? So Coinbase, announced they received this Wells notice, and then either the GC or chief legal officer there, very, I think accurately said, tell us what the laws are and we'll follow them. Right. Because, if anyone is doing we're going to just follow all the rules game, it's Coinbase, right? Like it or leave it. Right. But that's their angle. And if they can't figure it out, then, what hope does anyone else have?
And also the SEC already approved them to trade as a security in the United States. So it's a bit weird that the SEC is going to now come on and say, actually, we don't like anything that you're doing. It's pretty embarrassing.
It's of two minds, right? Because if you're a pure Bitcoin maximalist, you tend to believe that Gary Gensler's on your side.
Yeah, I don't like that.
You
view,
tend
though.
to believe that he's your guy. You know, he says "not your keys, not your coin" on TV, and everything else is a security. And he's had these lectures that he's had at the universities where he talks about Bitcoin being the only one that is actually a commodity. Again, I tend to, in that case, I'm not on the numbers go up crowd. I'm with the cypherpunks there. I say you don't want to have a government choosing winners or losers anyway.
Absolutely.
I'm not really, I think Elon Musk said it very correctly many years ago when he said, look, I have zero respect for the SEC or any of these institutions. They're out to crack down on you, not keep you safe.
Yeah. And it's clear that, Gary Gensler was trying to be SBF's friend and his parents' friend. So I'm not a fan of when Bitcoiners think that somehow he's their friend, because he's definitely not.
They had 13 meetings on the record.
Yeah,
it's pretty wild, right?
You think there will be any good blue ribbon committees that will come out of that and actually hold them accountable, or no?
No.
Well, this is the problem, is a lot of it goes through Congress, and the House Finance Service Committee was chaired by Maxine Waters, who knows nothing about any of this stuff and was best buddies with SBF as well. So that the first investigations that took place before this new Congress sat down were like, yes, let's get all of our rage going. But we didn't get to the bottom of anything. We don't know about all the meetings that were held. I mean, look, I try to get meetings all the time with politicians to meet about certain issues. I can't get in the door. I'm not giving them $2 billion, but I can't get in the door. So what does that say about the political process? What does it say about, many of them? I mean, the fact that the Senate Agricultural Committee were the ones that were targeted because they oversee CFTC, that shows we got kinks in our system, man. It cannot be that you just help fund someone's reelection and all of a sudden, your crypto exchange is at the front of the line, especially when you're committing fraud, by the way.
That's how that system works, though. So,
unfortunately.
Yeah, and it's, whatever your thing is, right? If it's FDA approvals or, banking licenses or, farm bill, insert here, right? That's how it works. I don't see that changing. That seems to be getting worse.
Yeah, I think you could say that, or it's always been this bad, and just many more people know it because we have many more, sort of innovations and technologies that we have to use, and then, people have to spend money on lobbying, and I am not opposed to lobbying. I mean, I lobby myself. I'm not opposed to it because it is a way for you to get involved in the democratic process, but unfortunately, this process is fairly cooked, especially if you're raising money for someone, doing this, and they kind of do what you say. I mean, the bigger problem, and I'm going back to my classical liberal roots here, is that the government has grown so big, so massive, that it is so involved in all these issues that you do essentially have to pay to play. Otherwise, you're going to get regulated out of existence. So what we need to do is actually reduce the scope of what government agencies do so that we don't even need to do this. Relegate it perhaps to the local level as much as possible, where you have, a lot more impact, or just figure out another way we can do this. Because I think that is the larger problem. I mean, we're talking about the United States right now, largest, richest country in the history of the world, but also the most indebted entity, that's ever graced this solar system. So I don't know what the future is.
Yeah. What do you think about if there were more, quasi-permanent or longer duration bans on working in the industry that, you oversaw or regulated or issued contracts to mitigate that regulatory capture, right? So maybe it's 10 years before you can retire from the CFTC and go be on the board of a crypto exchange, right?
Yeah, I think those are pretty ineffective. Everyone's got lawyers, especially if you're at that level. So there's just unique ways you do about it. If you're just consulting, then, it's not really the same kind of relationship. It's just about registering as a lobbyist, on the Federal Register of Lobbyists. So there are ways around that. Look, I think people should be free to have these pursuits. And, we shouldn't be surprised if Nancy Pelosi, once she retires, turns around and becomes a lobbyist for, I don't know, Pfizer or some other company. Do you want to have rules that say you can't have the revolving door of this and that? Perhaps, but then they'll just hire the chief of staff, right? or they'll just hire like someone else who is in the office. And there's always ways around that. I think it really just comes down to restricting what our government can do, what powers it does have. And yeah, sure, we'll call it out, but the media is not always quick to do this, because I think the position of Barney Frank when it comes to Signature Bank is very interesting. He's someone who wrote the banking regulations, then was on the board, and he was blindsided by all of this. They interviewed him on the New York Times Daily podcast, and he was apparently hanging out in the Caribbean. So it's like he had no idea what was going on. So I don't know if any of the particular bans on lobbying past a certain time, because all they do is just go work at a private firm and go back. I will say the numbers have increased, though. I have followed that of former legislators who come back to lobby. It's only gotten bigger in the last couple of years. I mean, they're required by law to register, but nobody goes back like George Washington to their farm anymore. I think only Jesse Ventura was the last one who kind of did it, right? He was governor, and then he went back and started his RT show.
Wrong network, unfortunately, for him.
Oh, I think he even had a show on the Venezuela network at one point, so he was just kind of desperate for viewers.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Did he really?
Telesur, yeah.
Wow. Well, yeah, I think that there's definitely gonna be ways around, like you said. Any other, I don't know, bright spots that you're seeing with consumer choice as it relates to Bitcoin?
So there's one thing that Balaji talked about on his program a while back. There's this island nation of Palau, and it's out in the middle of nowhere, Pacific Island, right? And they have this digital residency program, and it's very much mirrored after the Estonian e-residency program, which does allow you to start a company, and then you're able to use their administration essentially to run your daily affairs. I would say that because of the U.S. banking industry rules, and because of FATCA, which is a terrible law that should definitely be eliminated tomorrow, that plus the Bank Secrecy Act, it's made it more difficult. But what's interesting about these areas is they're trying to create, I mean, unfortunate wording, but Web3 sort of registration. And they want to allow people to become digital residents. And I think innovation in citizenship is something that would be very cool to see. We're seeing it a bit more. The EU is tightening its investor citizenship rules, which probably were abused by many Russians, obviously. I think that kind of stuff would be great. I would love to see much more ability for people to choose where they can live. Now, at the same time, you have to agree and accept that immigration should be more open than it is today. And that's not the general trend. The US and Canada yesterday, Trudeau and Biden, they just signed like a new agreement to make it so that people cannot, if they're trying to become a refugee, they can't claim status in the US or Canada because there's a small part of the country, it's Roxham Road. It's between New York and the province of Quebec. And a lot of people were just kind of using that to go to Canada. They would get some kind of refugee status, and then they were able to stay. So that is now being closed. So we're also becoming kind of more restrictionist when it comes to immigration. And we're not even talking about the boats in the Mediterranean and everything else. That all stems from the economic problems that you have in the developing world. And many of that is caused by instability, and Matt's talked about that in previous podcasts with Alex Gladstein and the rest. A lot of his financial sort of colonialism. There's all kinds of different things. I hope there's going to be advancements there, because if we're able to actually choose the country we want to be in, and you guys, if you've been immigrants, you've had to deal with paperwork and all this kind of stuff, and we know many people who are kind of stuck in that bureaucracy, that Franz Kafka, the trial. Hopefully we can get rid of that. And I don't know exactly, perhaps it's going to take a warrior nation like Estonia or Palau or something else, but I think that could be very interesting. And hell, maybe it'll be in the Carolinas at the Catawba Digital Economic Zone.
Yeah, I even heard on the BBC they were talking about Tuvalu, similar oceanic sort of region there, right? And same thing. They were actually, from the perspective, of course, as always, the BBC, of climate change, and the island, like in 50 years, might be completely underwater. But that's their push, is to get completely digital and have their citizens be completely digital. Like, doesn't matter where the nation itself could live online. That was the idea, and I think you're right. Goes back to what we said about sovereign individual. That would be great if we could keep pushing that forward. But listen, I want to be sensitive to your time here. Maybe as we close it, we can go back to a more real world topic on the ground. Some dangerous times actually close to you. couple countries over in France. You're our resident French speaker here as well. You have so many different nationalities. Yeah. What is your read of what's happening in Paris right now?
Oh, France is interesting because France was, when Macron was first elected, he was obviously a former banker guy, but he came in as a liberal reformer, and that's big L, liberal reformer. And the idea was that we got to cut taxes, we got to innovate, we need to have tech companies coming out of France. He was kind of lost in the weeds for about 6 years and now has come to his senses, and he's probably looked at the books and seen that there's no way that the French state can sustain itself, even by having an open immigration policy. So they have to raise the retirement age. It's pretty simple. Macron's been very sharp in the last, I would say, 2 weeks. He's been doing a lot of interviews. In France, they really love radio. So he's been doing every radio station, up and down. It's a very centralized country politically, but he has made an effort to go to Bretagne, and he's gone out west, and he's gone to the south, and he just kind of made the case. It's like, look, we're in a global economic crisis. Interest rates are up. Looking at our own finances in France, we won't survive as an entity, as a country, if we don't reform the way that we do things. And that starts with raising our retirement age. Sorry, that's what we have to do. And I would rather be frank as a president than sit here and lie to you and kick the can down the road, which is like, thank you, Macron, where you've been the last 6 years. But yeah, obviously in France, you have political upheaval. And I think it's more, if you're in a government and you're trying to push through these reforms, it is with better merit than many of the climate change goals. Because when the climate change goals came in, France said, okay, we have to reduce our carbon emissions. That's when they started raising taxes on gasoline. And that's when you had the yellow vests. So that was like sort of a different affair. Now it's generally people who are just, sort of the protest in the UK many years ago against austerity, against reducing the size of the state. France has, I think it's like 45 to 50% of the people kind of work in some kind of public administration job. So yeah, it's just constituencies very upset to that. Probably a lot of handouts that have been very generous in the French system. Yeah, interesting times, and there's all kinds of reasons you can hate the government, but hey man, if they're trying to reform things, what can you really do?
Do you think though that the brutality of the police is just something that we see more of as social media becomes more ubiquitous, or?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And we saw this, the worst, I think that goes back to 2014-15, is Catalonia had their vote for independence. And, the police went out in just absolute brutality, smashing the faces of people. I mean, there's all this kind of stuff was just amazing to see. And that was just because people held a vote, right? So obviously, if people are out in the streets, police will be kicked back. And, we saw this in the U.S., whatever it was, 2 years ago. And there's a lot of pressure on police. And I think that's why technology is a good thing, because then we can see exactly what's happening. We can have a bit more accountability, assuming that the laws are followed. But I expect there's probably going to be a lot of protests. We have to remember the Arab Spring. Why did that spring up? It's because food prices were way too high. Vendor burned himself. The administration that you have to do to own a food cart. I can only imagine with a higher interest rates, more austerity. Yeah. I thought I was supposed to end on a positive point.
Yeah. Self-effigy is not exactly that, is it?
It is not, but it is okay because we burn bright and orange, and there are greater tomorrows and many different opportunities. And I'm actually very hopeful that entrepreneurs are finding answers to this stuff every day. And many times they're not getting to the top of our Twitter feeds or Nostr feeds or whatever it might be. But people are doing great things. We just have to turn around and, be a very curious consumer of as many technologies and products and services as possible.
Well, listen, yeah, that's a great note to end it on. Where can our viewers and listeners find out more about what you're doing and how to contact you, so on and so forth?
Yeah, I'm writing way too much these days, but I'm over there at the Consumer Choice Center, basically our own little consumer advocacy group that we started a couple years ago, and now on Fix the Money, a podcast here in Vienna with Austrian Bitcoiner Nikolaus Yaël, trying to stay true to the message and see what we can do for the protocol ourselves. So. All right. Catch me online. I'm the only Yaël Ossowski in the world, so find me.
We will link to all that for sure. Great, man. Thanks a lot for coming on. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, man.
Thank you so much.